introduce everyone around the table so you know who it is you're talking to, where they're from and what their backgrounds are. But Nick Tyler, now let me get this right, Nick. Are you a trained musician? Is that your beginning? I think Nick must be the only graduate of music that's become head of the civil engineering department of a university in the world. That's probably true, isn't it?
Good role.
And I won't mention who it was, but someone quite high up, previously in government, said to me, "How did Nick Tyler become head of the School of Civil Engineering when he was a musician?" Now you can answer that later on. Anyhow, so this is not a typical civil engineer. Indeed, if a civil engineer at all won't even go there, that you're having talked to you today. Flattery I don't do very much. I really don't do flattery. Those of you who know me know I don't do flattery. But in this particular case, there is no doubt about it, from the field of transportation to the field of open thinking in infrastructure, and in terms of breaking down silos in education. I really have to say that Nick is someone that's made huge achievements against the odds. So I'll leave it at that, to say that you've got an innovative thinker here making a presentation. I have no idea what he's going to say. So I'm open, my mind's sort of looking forward to it. It's very international, from Peru to London, and from micro to macro, although I specifically asked Nick to deal with mega projects. So, thanks Nick for coming along. He actually spends more time in an aeroplane in airports than he does, I think, I shouldn't say that.
My carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprints, yes. Okay, let's go around the room. If you could just very briefly introduce your name, your affiliation, and your background in terms of, whether you're a fan architect and which country you're from. Yeah.
Colin Osborne, project manager for Century Foot, which is another transport project in the Bartlett. And I'm a Tyler.
Phil Ryan, planner, Omega Centre.
Gualtiero Bambino, PhD student at Bari School of Planning.
Full Hall in Bali School of Planning. And today I'm doing mega infrastructure planning professional development. I'm a counselor.
I graduated AA school. Sorry, I graduated AA school historical theory, and I'm not concerned with Bartlett at this moment, but I'm taking on.
Okay.
I'm Dan Durant, I'm a PhD student at the Omega Centre.
I'm Helen, I'm from MSc Urban Studies.
I'm Faisal Al-Sderi, I'm a student at the Bartlett School of Planning.
Hi, I'm Adiraza Gulabi. I'm doing my master's in infrastructure planning in Bartlett.
Sorry. I'm David, student at Bartlett School of Planning as well.
I'm Vivian, I'm a mega infrastructure student.
I'm Liang Chao from China, I'm now as business scholar in Cambridge.
I'm Teza Soil, a student from Montenegro, MSc student at Michael.
I'm Brian Garcia, I'm a PhD in planning student.
Johnny Chen, planning student here, doing PhD as well.
Hi, I'm John Moore from the Omega.
Roger Walpole, transport economist working in the period.
Mazhar Maida, doing masters in mega infrastructure planning with an architectural background and construction.
Okay, right, well, I'm not too sure I missed it either, really. Well, thank you first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, Harry.
Yeah, thank you.
It's very. Yes, you can. This is black, so I can't see what's happening on here. So this is going to be very interesting. I thought what I'd do is I'd talk a little bit about how we're sort of starting to think about mega projects. Harry asked me to have a look at these huge projects, and it does occur to me that there's potentially an awful lot of money going to be spent on what we might loosely call a mega project. We're not not terribly sure I know what a mega project is. So I thought what might be interesting would be to consider a little bit about the sort of things that might come into the category of mega projects, and then think about how we think about these and whether that actually tells us about what we then want to do. And some of you have mentioned about being in infrastructure and planning and all those sort of things, and I think it might be just a useful opportunity to think a little bit around the hinterland around what the mega projects actually are, so we can actually cause ourselves to think a little bit more about why we do them, or if we should do them. So, really, and I'm not going to speak for ages, so you'll be quiet. But the idea really is to sort of try and fire up a bit of a discussion and so on. So I'm just going to move around this one and see that. Okay. So the first, so one example of a mega project, we have, in the UK, we have an example coming up on high-speed rail, which is being a bit contentious, and maybe, I don't know how actually heard the Queen's speech this afternoon, it might or might not appear, you never know. But we do have HS2, so here is a UK version, if you like, of a, in our terms, a sort of mega project. And what you'll see there is a sort of version, which is sort of trying to make out what we're talking about at the moment is this bit. And essentially the idea is, yes, we have a bit of a network here, because we have another one which we've already built. And the idea is there will be a bit more later on. But what you're actually seeing is, the green bit is what, £30 billion. It's a large project that has a lot of infrastructural issues about it. And really the interesting bit about this particular project is actually not this bit, but all that. In other words, the linkage that provides and what opportunities that sort of provides. And that, some would regard that as being a pretty big project. And you might like to think about that. If we were to go to China, that, if you can make that out, I'm just trying to find a good map. Yeah, that is the high-speed rail network proposed for China. And there's a whole pile of stuff in there which comes into this. And I think one of the interesting things about this is actually the debate as to whether what they're trying to build is a high-speed rail network, or and is that the mega project, or is the mega project about reducing migration from west to east in China? Is it about developing a network of what they call super cities? And this map, in a sense, starts to answer some of those questions. So the question is this a mega project as a high-speed rail project, or is it a mega project which is about how a country, obviously a huge country, is going to develop in the future? And I think that's one sort of thing to park at the back of your mind when we're talking about mega projects, because there's a whole pile of issues in there. So if, for example, we have a look at what was actually involved there. First of all, there's about 30,000 kilometres of high-speed rail in that network. So it compares with 100 or so kilometres up to Birmingham. 30,000 kilometres, an awful lot of it. It's going to connect up about 250 cities, population rather greater than Europe. Going to be connected. It's going to accommodate about 4 billion trips a year. A lot of those will happen in 2 weekends over the Spring Festival. There's a huge travel opportunity in China around the Chinese Spring Festival, when half the country moves to the other half, basically, and back again. So a large number of trips, a lot of passenger kilometres, and this concept of the super city clusters, and the idea is that the railway network would develop 4 new ones and would expand to that they sort of, I think it's happenstance more than anything, but the 2, one based really around the Yangtze Delta in Shanghai, and the other around the Bell River Delta, basically Guangzhou, Guangdong, so on. Those cities are already in there, and what they're seeing as the super city cluster is and this is quite an interesting one, is a city is somewhere where the travel radius is around about 3 hours. So that would be Manchester. It's quite an interesting concept of what they're trying to deliver. And one of the big issues for them is there is a huge difference between the east of China and, if you like, putting it very, very simply, the west. So the east has has places like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and so on. Guangzhou is technically in the south, so close. But essentially that side of China, large amounts of development, wealth, land prices, etc., etc., etc. The west, very much more rural, and as a consequence of that, there are issues about people moving from one to the other, and there are all sorts of issues that we don't need to get into today. But by having a network which is enabling travel to happen much more evenly across China, there is a sort of sense of being able to enable cities in the north and the west to be able to develop more as a result of that, of those transport links, and therefore the temptation, or arguably the need to migrate, reduces. And that then saves quite a lot of problems for later on. At the moment, China is expecting to have to accommodate 20 million new urban dwellers a year for the next 50 or so years. That's what they're sort of working to at the moment. And that's like building 3 Londons a year. 2 to 3 Londons a year. It's quite a lot of urban stuff got to be developed, and the more that they can actually spread that out, the easier it's going to be to accommodate. So there is a sort of mega project. But of course we have a problem with this. There they are building all this stuff, and of course we do have problems where corners begin to get cut in the process of trying to do it very quickly. Whole piles of issues about what happened there and why. And one might argue, and I'm not going into why that happened, but one could argue that the eye is taken off one board and put on another. It's more important to have the network constructed and built and operating quickly so that we can have them open at the right date, than it is necessarily to get the issues sorted out properly. So there have been discussions around whether the speed at which the railways were operating was actually pushed upwards by the politicians without the appropriate technical support being provided in order to be able to do that. Why was that? Well, because, and this becomes an issue which I think, one of the things that comes around these very, very large, very super important projects is about how they're managed, what the governance is for these sorts of projects, and how the influences on decision-making may be good or less good. And there's some interesting questions around that. We can look at another couple of examples from China. Eco-cities. China's very keen on eco-cities, partly because part of this is to do with the people they have to accommodate, and partly because of the pressure which is felt quite strongly about carbon emissions in China. And certainly internally in China, there's a huge amount of pressure on reduction of carbon emissions. Transport is one of the big areas where carbon emissions are high, and therefore there's lots of things to do with transport that they want to try and reduce. And they are looking at a number of eco-cities. This is one of them, Tianjin. And this is being built in cooperation with Singapore, mostly technical help coming from Singapore, rather than money. And you can see there a sort of concept of the city with light rail. It's quite large, 3,000 hectares, 300,000 residents. Quite a lot of that is residential, but the rest is sort of mixed use. So some commercial, some industrial, some social infrastructure, to try and make a coherent type of city. How successful that will be as a vibrant city is another question, but there is a large project which is trying to colour how people are going to live over the next few generations by the nature of the way using the city and its design and sort of things that are promoted to colour the way that people will live in the future. How much understanding there is in these sorts of projects is interesting in terms of how that matches with people's aspirations. If you want to buy a Lamborghini, how does that tally with, are they going to be able to deliver that, or the matching aspiration in an eco-friendly way, is an important question. And it's something which we are looking at in another city which I'll mention shortly. Another example is a place called Dongtan. Dongtan, very fun. It's sort of in the Yangtze Delta, so near Shanghai, and inside the Yangtze Delta you have this island. On this island, and at this end of it, proposing to build, or work proposing to build a city called Dongtan. Dongtan is going to have all sorts of eco-friendly characteristics, and this is what it's going to look like. Rather larger than Tianjin, both in terms of area and residents, but the idea is it's a sort of completely zero emission base. So heavily based on renewable energy, the water treatment and water recycling, very, very prominent part of how it's going to operate, and how water is used in different ways, keeping noise down, particularly transport systems. Lots of those trees are there as much to keep light from escaping, so they're keeping the light pollution down, but also heavily intentioned to deliver low or zero emission transport systems. It's a huge operation. They engaged, it was all kicked off at a very, very high level. They even got Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in on the act at one point. But there is a difficulty. The first one is the person actually promoting it ended up in prison because he basically, there was a whole sort of some interesting corruption issues. But actually, he had another side problem. Where he was going to build this city was a UNESCO World Heritage scientific site. It's a big wetland there for which is a big UNESCO area for huge flocks of birds. So quite rumble from this kind of and therefore it sort of stopped. And there's some sort of indication that elsewhere on the island something is going to happen along these lines, but it won't be a Dongtan. So we come back to this question that we're looking at a super large project, very ambitious, trying to do good things, where it stalls is around governance. And rather than the technical capabilities of what's going to go on there might or might not happen, but the leadership of it and the way it's managed and governed becomes super critical, I think, for these sorts of projects. Then there's some other sorts of projects. Some other examples. We have the Thames Tunnel here being proposed at the moment, amongst some controversy about that. The idea of this is really that we have a bit of a problem. If we have more than 2 millimetres of rain in London, the Bazalgette sewer system, famous Bazalgette sewer system, basically overflows into the river, to put it very simply. And the idea of this is so that it doesn't overflow into the river, it overflows into the Thames Tunnel under the river. And this would be a huge effort, about 25 kilometres long, vast tunnel. And the idea is to pick up all the overflow, if you like, from these sewers. It's a bit controversial. Certainly it's very expensive and complicated to do. There's quite a lot of opposition, not so much in this case politically, I think. I don't really get a sense of where the politicians sit. I think mostly on the fence on this one. But technically, there's a lot of technical people who are saying this is not the right answer to the problem. And there are various proposals around. So that's partly driven by the expense, I think. So what we propose is a highly expensive solution. People are saying you don't need to spend that money. So there is an interesting question in there about how we approach what we think a project like that, or like any of these projects, should be for the future. Because when we come to infrastructure, in particular engineering projects of any size, we're not really talking about what's happening today. We're talking about what's going to happen a few generations down the line. The lifetime of a railway system is really very long. It wouldn't be unreasonable to sort of think in terms of a couple of 100 years. Really, there will be some maintenance, and I'm not saying it would work perfectly for 200 years. But as a piece of infrastructure, where it is, it's going to be dominating things for that sort of period of time. And therefore, how we think about what we do is actually about how we think 2 centuries down the line. And Brundtland very famously said that sustainability was meeting present needs without compromising the needs of future generations, very conveniently without having any sense of how we know what the needs of future generations are going to be. So we have to take a guess and a punt at what we think those are going to be. And when you think about future generations, what does that mean? It means 3, 4 generations into a century or so. And therefore, and the sort of infrastructure we build now, people who are born now will be using. It's quite a thought. And if you think backwards, if you think back to, I know it didn't work this way, but if you think back to the early 20th century, when some of the deep tube lines were being built from London, if they had thought about what London would need in the early 21st century and built the metro system to accommodate that, I suspect if they had known, if they had a sort of magic sort of knowledge of what we actually are trying to do with the tube system now, we would have a different tube system. And the difficulty is how you actually make that forward projection. And it's not just about trends and things, it's about changes in the way people live, and their preferences, and all sorts of other things that don't fit into some of these other historical details. And we also have an issue, I think, now, where if you look at the sort of climate change graphs, I mean, they're just taking a generic thing, you see a climate change issue which where you see what we call a hockey stick graph. So you see it's pretty flat for a few thousand years and suddenly sort of puts up on the right hand end because temperature's changing. But you can actually write a very similar looking graph about economic complexity, about technological advances, about all sorts of things. And we are at the moment on that cusp, on that curve of the hockey stick. So not only are we now very conscious that we have to deal with how people in 100 or 200 years are going to be living and what they're going to require of our infrastructure, but also what the infrastructure can and should do anyway, and what technology is going to be available to us, what financing regimes are going to be able to pay for it, is also on the cusp of that curve. Everything is going to change. So there's a reasonable question, in my mind, as to how much we can actually rely on history to tell us what to do. So extrapolating a trend is a dangerous game at the moment. And if you're looking at mega projects, just because of the size and because of their intention, what they're trying to do, we're right in the middle of that rather heavy game of hockey. And I think that's an important issue about how we actually look at it. So, why do we think about it? It's also difficult. So why do we do mega projects? Well, of course, the first thing is we all love the civil engineering department, and civil engineers love mega projects. The bigger the better. Let's dig it deeper, higher, or any direction. They all think it's great. And they even like knocking down big things as well. There's a whole branch of civil engineers that love to knock things down, and the bigger things they can knock down, the better, and it's really great fun. Planners, if we can plan an entire city, fantastic. We can really do that. Politicians love it because they can put a badge on it. Financiers love it for the same sort of reason. The person who's putting up the money for the Shard, for example, that's purely and simply why he's doing it. It's because he wants to spend money, basically, on something big, shiny, and obvious, and so on. So it fits a lot of people's wish. It's an interesting question as to whether the lonely companies actually go for it. It's an interesting question. We'll see. I think is the answer to that one. But the question that I sort of tend to ask about these things is, well, actually, what are they really trying to solve? What is a mega project actually trying to do? Is it fitting all these things, it's making the engineers happy and so on, but how clear are we about what that problem is? You think back to that Chinese high-speed rail network. There's some level in there. One of the reasons they were cutting corners, if they were cutting corners, one of the reasons that was going on, why it was so politically interesting, was because politicians saw that as a sign of progress and so on, that they could build a very high-speed railway network in a very short time, so they could actually just get that going. High-growth society, high-growth economy, they wanted to change that, and it's all fine, that's what they wanted to do. But how much did that progress actually help to solve the deeper problem about the migration, the difference between the rural-urban economy and so on? Was it actually really driving that, or was it really driving simply having a high-speed railway? It's an interesting question. So I think it's something which I suspect that the bigger the project, the less we actually think too hard about why we do it, and so on. So I thought it would be quite interesting to talk about a different sort of mega project, Transoceanica in South America. And this is essentially, here's a big picture of it. Well, as we'll see, it's a picture of it. To point out where we are, the green bit is Brazil, or part of Brazil. This is Peru. And the blue thing along here is the Rio Amazon. Okay? And if we were to position this, where are we? Manaus is a very curious city on the Amazon. It's about 1,600 kilometers from the sea. At that point, the Amazon is around about 12 kilometers wide. It's about 40 meters deep, so it's getting towards looking a bit like the English Channel. It's not quite as wide as the English Channel. And it is an ocean-going port. So ocean-going ships will sail to Manaus. In fact, the ocean-going ships carry on and they go to Iquitos. Iquitos is about 3,500 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? Everything about the Amazon is big. Okay? So Manaus is there, so that gives you a rough idea. And part of the Amazon goes down here, or comes, actually, it's a really interesting thing about this is that where these two meet, they come from very different climatic systems. And as a result, one comes basically from the jungle, and the other one comes basically from the mountains. And the water is completely different. So in one case, you have water which is full of organic matter, so it's sort of black colour. And the other is full of mineral stuff out of the mountains, this sort of pale brown, I guess. And they're different temperatures and densities, and therefore they don't mix. So for about 16 kilometers after they meet, the two colours of water go along side by side in the river. And it takes about 16 kilometers for them to sort of get themselves sorted out so they actually meet. It's an amazing place. That's Manaus. So the idea is that you can sort of sail up this river in what is called here Porto Velho, Portuguese for old port. So it's a nice idea to have an old port quite a long way from what we would think is great. But it clearly is. And then to build a road network which will take you to the Pacific. So you can get some idea of the distance. This is about 2,000 kilometers. So you get some sort of idea of the distances you're dealing with here. This is a big project to build a road. Interestingly, some interesting features about that. First one is that when it hits the Pacific, it doesn't quite hit the Pacific. Sort of misses it a bit. There is a port down here, it's a little bit further off there, but to be honest, the real port in Lima is here, in Peru is there. This is a natural, huge, natural deep water port. There is obviously a problem because between sort of here and here is a thing called the Andes. And the Andes goes up around here, where Cusco, for example, famous place, Cusco is about 3,300 meters above sea level. Up here you'll be up at 6,000 meters above sea level. Titicaca here is 4,000. So you've got something to go over or through. Technologically, it can be done. You have to do things, it's obviously hard, big infrastructure stuff, and you have to do things with your vehicles so they can travel and work at that. So the altitude could be done. question is, the journey time, what is this actually doing? Right now, very little would actually go from here to here. So what actually would happen? What's this about? Well, one thought is that it depends which direction you're going. Okay, so in here, you grow lots of things like soya, and you might want to export soya across the Pacific. So if you can get it across here, then you can get it into a port, you can get it near the port, and off to China or Russia. On the other hand, at the moment, certainly, it is quicker to send it that way, into Brazilian ports, around the Atlantic, around the bottom of South America, and send it that way. Or possibly even to go straight across the Atlantic, around the bottom of India, and go. It's the other way around. So there's all sorts of things. Is this actually going to make that competitive? That's a good question. And that leads you to, is there an economic case for that? Does it stack up? Is it going to be expensive? And what's the political, geographical case for that? What's actually going on? So we'll have a look at that in a minute. So, we can just pull out a little bit from that. So this is obviously South America. What we've just been looking at, I guess, is a sort of area, this is the end of that river. Okay, and that network we've just been looking at comes down here. So around here. Okay, this actually is an agreement by presidents of South American countries on sort of integration of regional transport networks. This is actually all roads. So the way you see these sort of rather heavily coloured lines in here, these are roads. And the idea is that they would, or was, when they all met and agreed to do this, was that they would consider South America to be one place. And you would have, just like you would in England, you would have, or China, you would have roads in order to aid the economic development and so on. And they would regard these as a sort of regional road. So it's a bit like the European, the TEN network. And they have various versions of these, and it doesn't matter. There are different colours on here, and they represent that. And you also notice that roads sometimes is rivers, because you have this enormous river going through it, and that's similar to using this. So you do have this, but really what this is actually renaming existing roads and sort of calling them part of this regional network. And in some cases, that will be a sort of motorway, freeway type piece of infrastructure. In some cases, it will be pretty awful. Some of it will not be surfaced, for example. So it's not necessarily the case that it will be the sort of road you would expect to see in the network. But it's really, the first stage is to say, well, actually, there is a road across here, there is a means of getting across down here, and that's what it would be. And we can then, that may become a priority, hence the intergovernmental agreements, that that's actually what we all do. So Argentina, sort of undertakes that this is going to be some sort of priority, and Chile undertakes that this is going to be some sort of priority. You can see sort of slight geographical differences between those two problems there. So one could actually do this. So they had in mind the idea of what you could regard as being a critical mega project, which is about how do we actually get the continent to function as a whole, as an economic powerhouse in world, global economics, and part of that's going to be about how you move stuff around. And that was part of their mission. And to start with, was simply to say, well, what have we got, and how does that work? If we look at a slightly different map, this is, if I were just to flash back to the other one, one of the things you'll notice on here is an awful lot of these things go up and down, and relatively few go across. And if you look at this one, they all go across. Okay? And this sort of supplants onto the other one. So the other one was really naming existing roads. And one of the reasons they all go up and down is because you have this huge column going down the back of Latin America, so down here, which is the Andes, and that's quite hard to cross. But this one is actually trying to set up sort of networks of roads, and these would be, the intention of these is that these are proper corridors, that these are designed to carry large amounts of material, and you can begin to see that you can find a way across Brazil into Peru and so on, in order to be able to do that. And across, and essentially, the idea is that what they do is they count up how many countries are involved in each road, and they have various tables that show them how much they're actually putting together. So their concept, and that's just roads, they have other things for railways and so on. The concept that they're talking about here is a mega project. This is about a continent. How is the economic, how is the transport and the planning and the city location and all the rest of it going to work at the scale of a continent in order to drive an economy, to make Latin America, South America, a driving economy in the world stage. Right now, Brazil, economically speaking, is fourth in the world, something like that. It's a large economy, huge economy, Brazil. The fastest growing economy in Latin America is Peru, by a long way. So Brazil is big, and the mistake people make is they see Brazil both physically and financially. They see it as big because all the numbers, everything is bigger in Brazil. But in terms of growth at the moment, Peru is running at getting on for 10% a year. Had a dip in 2009 after the global financial crisis, because a lot of that is coming out of minerals. Therefore, people not buying minerals because of the financial crisis gave them a dip, but they just come straight back up again last year, and they're now running at about 10% a year. So it's a fast-growing economy. It's quite a sort of mystery. Big opportunity for the UK, actually. So this is a continent which is vibrant and going to change. That's how they see it. So to them, this is a mega project. In the same way, I guess, that in China, the high-speed rail network is a mega project. The difference is that in China, you have a government able to decide things for the country and design it all here. Here we have 13 governments doing that. And therefore you have the complexity. Of course, we're quite used to that, because what we are much more familiar with is Europe, and we'll come to that in a minute. So, one of the questions I would ask, if you want to have a mega project, I think you have to have a mega problem. And the project really is an answer to the problem. And I think what would be really good for us to think about is how we define that mega problem. And the sort of issues that they're looking at in that continental picture of Latin America, why I think it's an interesting one to sort of set the mind going, is what is the problem they're trying to solve? Well, they're trying to make sure they've got access to markets within Latin America. Can I buy my resources? Can I buy the minerals in Peru? Can I buy the soy, the rice, whatever in Brazil? Do we have markets beyond Latin America? What can we sell to China, Russia? It's really interesting. If you look through the way they model all this, you will see there is, I don't have it here, but there is a map which, for example, shows how they will integrate with the Trans-Siberian Rail network. Really, really interesting picture of how they see the world. It's very, very different. And so those markets are actually very important to them. If they're going to be a global player, they're going to have to be able to deal with those markets, and they're quite a long way from quite a lot of places, so they think very openly about that. You have the huge question that we all have about interdependencies. What is the interdependency between getting the transport infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, and so on, getting that so it all works together, and how we can reduce risk as a result of that. And that's part of the mega problem. So how do I reduce the risks and get people to invest? On the other hand, we have to make sure there is enough redundancy. If you put all of your resources into one place, then it's a very nice place to blow up, because then everything will fall over. So how do you deal with that? So there's this sort of tension in there, they need to handle that. So how do we do that is another part of this mega problem. We have all these various resources, and these are things which you use and want. So energy, minerals, people, employment, very important there. And the distribution of all that across the countries to have some sort of equitable sense, that you don't end up with a very poor country. Because within the continent, that's quite a load for the others to bear. So part of their problem is how do we actually try and make sure that Brazil can do its big economy supported at the moment. Peru is growing. How do we actually try and get that as a more solid continental approach? And also, there are, even where you do have the strong economies and growing economies, you do have social development problems. So how do we actually resolve those? And that's part of the problem. And what they're after is the global political financial influence. They want to be at the top table. And that's what they're trying to do. So they're trying to make South America as that place. And that's what they're trying to do. That's why they're thinking about that sort of mega
Who is
project.
they?
They is the governments of
Association
Latin
with
America.
Latin America.
So and they have various sorts of...
Not the Inter-American Development Bank.
No. They might go to them.
Okay.
I don't think the IDB understands it.
Okay.
Is my impression. I don't think it's how they think. They want to lend to a government. And that brings us to another example of something rather like that. Here you have 27 countries attempting to do something. This happens to be the 10 road network and the bits of the sea networks and so on in Europe. And it's an interesting comparison. You know, we have quite a lot of stuff in here. We're very keen on how we get connectivity. We see all the benefits that you get from that sort of connectivity. And if we were to design it all as a huge mega project now, maybe we would actually have a better go at it if we saw it in that way, rather than bits and pieces and political negotiations and all that sort of stuff. It's an interesting question. But to compare those two is interesting. For example, Europe in land area is about a quarter of the size of South America. It has about a third as many population gain as South America. At the moment, we've got South America is shifting pretty fast economically. Europe is pretty stagnant in the range. So questions that I think really come out of the sort of my thinking about what engineering can do, and by engineering I mean the bits and pieces either side of engineering, so the planning and so on, but also the consequences of it, the social and financial consequences. How does all that help to resolve those future needs? The people who are going to be living in South America in 100 years' time, what's the life they're going to have, and how are we going to be able to make decisions to enable them to do that? Where do projects like mega projects fit into that? There's obviously a place, but how we see that is going to be really quite influential, because the scale of the mega project is so large that it will have an influence. So actually what we decide to do and how we decide to do it will have real consequences in the future. And I think as mega project people, we need to be thinking very hard about that. And then from there, how do we actually define what a project is? Because in essence, once we've done that, the rest is sort of relatively easy. But I think these are really key questions when we think about mega projects. It's not just about how we build a big project and how we put it all together, but actually, how is that going to make that influence for the future generations, and how's that actually going to work? And that, to me, is I thought it would be interesting to sort of bounce that across the table a bit, because it's something to think about. That's sort of what I was going to say.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, open the floor for discussions. Those of you from the Middle East or from Africa may want to throw some analogies.
Please do, yes.
I have a question about the Chinese high-speed rail. We all know that one of the main reasons about increasing the steel market price is this mega project. So this project have international huge implication, and in a way it's not responsible about it. Like, it have nothing to do with all the nations, but it is causing this problem. So how it should be controllable or managed in order not to affect international people, international projects or raw materials or whatever, a mega project?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, the normal way we do that is by money and price and things like that. But I think it is an issue. There are, I mean, things like rare earths and things like that that are important elements of a growing society. And how those materials, just taking those as an example, how they actually get distributed around the world. So, for example, most of Peru's copper at the moment is going to China, which is one of the reasons why Peru is doing very nicely, thank you, in its economy. But what about Africa? How is that actually going to work? Does that mean we deplete all our resources? Does that mean the price of copper gets very high? So that will transform the growth prospects of countries in Africa, for example, is a really important question. And I think the sort of destabilization by having a very, very large sort of consumer of these sorts of things in one place is a very interesting and very deep concern, and how we actually manage that is difficult. And I don't think we have the international mechanisms in place to deal with that. And perhaps we haven't needed to. It's only really been since, and maybe actually China is I mean, the example of China is unusual because it's such a large country, and since it freed up the economy in the early 1990s and so on, since that economy freed up, it's suddenly developed. So there's a very, very fast change in its economic circumstances. And it is one big country, so it can decide things, and it can do things, and it can do them very quickly because it has the resource. So it has actually been a very dramatic example. But the same thing would happen if we decided to build that entire road network in Latin America. The same thing would happen. It might be slower, because of the nature of those particular countries and their economies. So China is perhaps a bit like looking at something under a rather powerful magnifying lens, and therefore it's a bit untypical. But on the other hand, looking down a microscope, you can learn quite a lot of things. So I think there's some interesting questions about that. What is interesting is that because it's one large country as opposed to several smaller countries, you don't have that sort of filtering, the international filtering that would happen in South America, because at some point or other they're going to say, hang on a minute, I think we should build these roads in Argentina first for X, Y, Z reason, and we'll delay the ones in Peru in order to compensate or something like that. In China, you don't have that sort of international filtering that would start to manage that, because they can decide to do things. So I think it's a really, really important question as to how projects of this sort of scale are going to be international in their impact, wherever they actually are. And therefore, we don't really, I think, have the international mechanisms to deal with it. Why do I say that? Well, the other thing to think about is the international mechanisms that we have are things like, politically, are things like the United Nations. The United Nations was designed to stop two countries from going to war with each other. And it basically obviously cannot cope with a country being in war with itself, or lots of countries influencing lots of things. They can't deal with climate change, for example, because the mechanism doesn't work. All the things that are set up to enable disputes to be resolved about borders or societies work don't work for climate change. That's why Copenhagen was such a mess, anyway. So we don't have the international facility that would be able to do the refereeing, if you like, to be able to help resolve this problem. And maybe that actually is a really core issue that we should deal with, because the governance of these things, because it's so large, the impacts are so widespread, maybe we do need to rethink how we actually want to manage them. That was a very good question.
Maybe a good start, Harry asked the question, who the we were, is to start with considering who this we is. If we is the Chinese state, it has one particular characteristic, and that is that it believes and practices planning in a way that I haven't come across anywhere else like it. It actually does it, and it's effective. And all this planning and getting resources is part of a very sophisticated system. So if the we is a state like the Chinese state, it is sensible to talk in terms of plans which can be made to happen. If we is
Southeast Asia, ASEAN, then we is very different, because the planning capacity outside of what I see well-known places is poor. I worked at one stage on an ASEAN transport study, which was absolutely hopeless. And everybody wanted to build bridges and railways, linking everything up. And at the time, I was living in Manila, a city of 10 million people, in a country of, I don't know what it was, 100 million, next to Indonesia, which is one of the biggest countries in the world. And at that time, there were only 2 planes a day between Manila and Jakarta. And those stopped. You had to go through Singapore very soon. So I think you have to ask a lot about who the we is and what implications that has for the type of planning which is possible. A lot of railway planning, for example, if you look at what happens, is incremental. It's a sort of Dockland style thing. It happens in a fairly chaotic way because the environment's very chaotic, and it's probably the best way that it could happen. But if you've got a more deterministic environment, if you've got the capacity to plan long term, you can go in for the luxury of master plans and this and the other. So I think that might be
that's a good point.
Might be useful.
I think the more I think about these things, the more I think how important it is to get what I would loosely call governance right, and that's that's sort of what you're talking about. How how the we is determined and how they function becomes crucial to what's going to happen. And I think it's often the piece that we don't do. I think we somehow live with it and do something that it doesn't. But actually, I think more and more and more, I think it's really is the key to get that right.
So on the point of governance, you hinted early on when you were talking about who mega projects were for, and you hinted that tended to be promoters, elite groups, advocates of mega projects. But when you start looking at benefit at a global level, obviously the benefit is very abstracted, and it's very the people or the groups that tend to be served by that are the people who benefit from global flows of wealth and global flows of trade. But when you actually, and I think it's interesting that you picked South America, because the consequences of that at a local level can be so extreme. I mean, the consequences of new road building in some areas of South America are, almost akin to a Holocaust for some groups. And how do you can you construct future mega projects that, do you always have to accept that level of loss and that level of winners or losers? Or is it possible to develop mega projects, and particularly governance structures around mega projects that serve, I suppose, the sort of diverse global publics rather than just an elite interest?
Again, it's a very, very fundamental point, because we might look at it from the other side of the world as being a mega project, but if it was if that railway or that roadway was going through your garden, it's a very local, very small project. It's here, and that difference in perspective is actually, and every project has that. And mega projects have it, I guess, more because they're here. I think, I suppose what I'm sort of leaning towards is thinking that in the definition of the problem lies that sort of question, and therefore the project itself as being a response to that project, to that problem, should actually take that into account. So I have no idea how much of the Amazon jungle will need to be burnt to make that network, for example. But some of it will, that's for sure. And I think the way that one defines that problem becomes ever more crucial. And the problem that I see is that there's a bit of a tendency, and I can look around engineering departments, around universities, for example, not here of course, but there's rather too much of teaching about how you solve a problem and not enough teaching about how you work out what the problem is. And one of the outcomes of that is that people do build very successful careers about solving problems, but they don't really know they don't actually solve the problem that actually exists. And I think mega projects simply amplify that. And I think that the key to having a really strong, really want a better word, a real discipline in how you identify what a problem is a crucial part of this, because that way you can then start to define the project better, so you don't have these problems. And I think that's where it sort of comes in. And I just have a feeling, and I haven't really had a view on this, but I have a feeling we don't actually educate, or we're not educating, not here of course, but we're not educating the next generation. These are the people, the students that I teach today are going to be running these things in 20, 30 years' time. So we have a huge responsibility to get this right, because it's a long-term issue. And I think we, in this case, I think the we is around the world. I think I've been to, I go to degrees all over the place, and it's a fairly general thing that they are very good at teaching how to solve a problem, not very good at how you identify. And I think proper disciplined identification of problems would actually lead to much, much better projects and more likely to be successful.
I've got a couple of questions, very different questions that are interesting you at all. One is actually about the Latin American case and also the European case you illustrated. It does seem to me that one lesson is that it's easier to build vast continental scale mega projects where you have totalitarian or at least authoritarian regimes, where much of the European motorway network is still owed to Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. And we forget actually that Hitler's autobahn network extended right across Europe. Italy is now lost in Russia behind Kaliningrad. And then the gaps got filled in afterwards by democratic regimes. And it does strike me that the Chinese case is very similar, whereas in Latin America, you have an extreme case of national governments, which are really dominated by their urban elites, so that you get huge motorway systems in the cities like Buenos Aires and Santiago de Chile, and the road system between them is absolutely terrible. I actually made that crossing of the Andes from Mendoza to Santiago a year ago. It's absolutely terrible. And they allowed the railway to decay too, because there was a landslide, and so there is no sort of practical ability of these governments delivering to their sort of urban populations to deliver. And it struck me that the high-speed rail network in Europe suffers a bit of this, because you find that the border crossings are often the worst part. The TGVS goes at 320k across France, and then suddenly screeches to virtual standstill and gets to the German border. So that's one point. But the other point was, it did strike me that in terms of your main point of really setting objectives, going what you want to do, and then devising answers, we did not badly in this country. 60, 70 years ago, there was a guy in this department, Patrick Abercrombie, who produced a vast plan for Greater London, and governments actually implemented it. And they actually built eventually 11 new towns, which had worked rather well. When we had an airport problem 50 years ago, we set up a royal commission and fixed about it and produced a rather careful analysis of the solution, which didn't get adopted. But I often wonder if we've actually gone backwards in this country at any rate over 50 years from a kind of strategic planning approach to a rather chaotic, muddling through approach. Very much like a reaction to that.
Well, I totally agree with that. I think that's right. It's interesting what you're saying about the Latin American case and other topics. I've just been doing a piece of work for the Foreign Office in Peru, and it's a bit unusual for me to do people to work for foreigners. This is actually really is a piece of diplomatic work. But what they want to do is they are trying to encourage Peru, Chile and Colombia to work together to create a Western Latin American hub for trade opportunities with China and Japan and Russia, basically, and founded around the deep water port in Lima, which is a natural deep water port, so it's much easier. And that has implications for the transport network in the immediate environs of Lima, which is even more chaotic than the Trans-Andean road windows in Santiago. Is an absolute mess. And one of the things that became very clear, they asked us to have a look at how we could help Peruvians get their transport system up to the sort of level that you could actually have that discussion with the Chileans and the Colombians. And that was really the sort of diplomatic piece. That's why it's foreigners. Very, very interesting. And one of the things that became very, very clear was that Peruvians, and I don't think they're by any means unique in this, have a very poor hierarchy in terms of their technical competence. So they have people who can, one example was, we found people who calculated the green times of traffic signals in Lima. No problem about that. They've been doing it for 15 years, that's what they've been doing, and maybe they can be good at it, I don't know. People who decided where the traffic signals were are political appointments that change every time you change a map. And that had a number of impacts. One was that you have a constant change at that level with no sort of sense of anything except that everything has to be completed within an electrical term. And also there is no career progression for the people who are doing the traffic lights. So you get people coming out of university, very competent people coming out, planners, engineers and so on, coming out of universities, perfectly capable of doing all this sort of stuff, and they cannot go anywhere. They don't want to go to travel. There's no pay and there's no career. Because all they're going to do is one simple job. And one of the things that we have actually managed to get the Peruvian government to accede to is the idea of constructing a technical hierarchy in order to maintain a technical continuity beyond the political cycle. And that is something that what we've hung that on is Peru's commitment to the United Nations on reducing transport emissions. In order to do that, one of the points that we were making is you cannot do that if you don't have this level of competence. And that's sort of going, sort of answering, I think, is sort of what you're saying. What we're trying to do is to say you cannot do it in this rather, every time you change the president decided, for example, there is a metro line in Lima, which took 25 years to build 8 kilometres, it's very quick, and it has 4 trains. And that was designed by the president. And the next line they're sort of thinking about, and they want to build it in 3 years because that's the electoral cycle. But it doesn't really sort of occur to them that there is maybe a little bit of a problem about that. But if we can actually get that level of sense of being able to stand back from the immediate chaos and look at the bigger picture, as Abercrombie did, and so on, and others, Colin McCallum would be another, then you get a much better chance to be able to have that sort of approach without necessarily having to go through the totalitarian sort of Hitler-type approach of doing it. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the Peruvian one plays out. We've got another couple of years to work with the various government people in Peru. And they do have, it's interesting, because it's tacked on emissions. And I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with 5 cabinet ministers from Peru, from different ministries, so environment, finance, transport, energy ministers sitting around the table as to how they're going to do this. Next, at the end of this month, there is a big event where they are going to get up and say what Peru is going to do. And what they're basically going to say is coming out of this piece of work. And that is because they do buy into that sort of sense. We seem to have managed to catch them on a vibration that it's doing. And I think what you're saying is right. I think that we do have to think about how to do that, and that has to be part of the Mega project. Maybe might be the most difficult part. Much easier to do at the time. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think it could well be that if the UK could pick up what it learned in those eras, we actually have something which is very valuable to those sorts of projects. I think the scope is actually huge for us to be able to do.
Yeah, let me ask you, so do you consider, as it was totalitarianism before, like in Chile they built a highway all the way from Santiago to Peru during Pinochet, but later now, for example, when the national government was there, do you think that the integration process between Mercosur of one part of South America and Andean coalition, what you mentioned is Chile, Bolivia, and not Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. So do you think that further integration into Mercosur would also ease this process as opposed to totalitarianism of the creation and implementation of mega infrastructure projects?
It's interesting. I have seen a map of Peru carved up. Heaven only knows where the person who drew it is, which actually had South America divided into four. And part of it was what you would loosely call the southern part of Mercosur. So you actually drew the line across it, it would have some of Brazil in it, Argentina, Chile, maybe Brazil.
Uruguay, Argentina,
Uruguay would creep in there, yeah. And possibly Paraguay. Then you have there was a sort of right-hand bit which was mostly Brazil, and then about half of Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia was another part, and then there was another part. As for governmental, regional, economic pieces of Latin America, I have no idea where that was gone. I have seen where it came from. Well, I know where it came from. It came out of consideration of how Latin America was going to treat itself in the world economy. But I suspect that isn't something that's going to exist very quickly somehow. But yes, you're right. And I think the issue of how, I mean, those road network things came out of 13 presidents all meeting together and deciding what to do. Many of those presidents, of course, are no longer presidents. And so the question is how that sort of thinking gets maintained over a period is a key point, and that's sort of where potentially things like Mercosur might work. But Mercosur is really, I think, it's not like the European Union.
Because it's trying to be.
It's much, well, they're trying to be, but it is difficult because it's a sort of, it's a bit like, I suppose, the old common market was a sort of economic agreement. And it's a bit there, and they would like to be looking a bit more like the European Union, looking at other social and political issues. But I think it's got quite a long way to go.
Because they have their own plans, transcontinental plans for infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
I've seen as for Bolivia also the tunnel below Peru, below Chile also to get a piece of sea port there.
Bolivia was very upset about Chile seeing the railway line from the 18-something or other. Yes, there's a long story about that. But yeah, I think that is right. And of course, what we should bear in mind is that the common market, the original 6 countries, really came out of the Second World War, and how on earth they were going to struggle to sort themselves out after a huge demolition program, essentially. And that's what drove that down. In the sense that, fortunately, they haven't had that sort of trauma in some Latin America, in South America, and we wouldn't want it to. So it's how one actually has a more intellectual growth. I really do believe that academics and universities have a real role in this, actually, because it is about education and training and how people, encouraging people to think. And I think we have a real, I would put it, we have a responsibility to make sure that people do learn how to think about these things in a way that enables that to happen. And it doesn't mean it's going to happen next week, it's a long-term issue. So I think it's a very, very important role we have in these things.
You mentioned eco-cities in China. And these eco-cities are essentially new towns or new urban areas.
like Dongtan?
Well, the five eco-cities that were used as or are being used as demonstrators certainly are. Dongtan was started as a sixth because the mayor of Dongtan was rather affronted that Shanghai was not included. The mayor of Shanghai was rather affronted that Shanghai was not included as one of the five, so he decided to set up his own. Unfortunately, he chose a world protected site, and so on. So that was rather unfortunate. Yes, so they're designed like that. But I'm involved in another project called the Low Carbon City Development Project, which is being run out of the Ministry of Science and Technology. And that is actually acting as a sort of umbrella project to encourage cities to develop low carbon, or in a low carbon way, and to not necessarily to pay. They don't pay very much money to the cities. Most of these cities are paying for this themselves, but these are existing cities that are aiming to change. There will be some growth and there's some new build there, but a lot of it is about how they change to retain aspects of those cities while they are transferring into a low carbon economy. So, and that has some very interesting impacts. So, for example, Guangzhou really doesn't want to be like Shanghai in the sense that Shanghai sort of flattened all its traditional, or large part of its traditional heritage, is what we would call it, and it was traditional housing and things like that in order to build its financial powerhouse. Guangzhou looks at that and says, well, actually, we would quite like to have a low carbon version of our existing part, at least part of this, it's going to be like that. So there's a sort of interesting dynamics coming in there. Another city which nobody's ever heard of, called Nanyang, in the centre of China, where they grow the rice. And we have a really interesting project with them because they are looking, they have, in Nanyang is a huge bioenergy company. And the bioenergy company is looking to see if they can identify the enzymes to extract hydrogen from waste rice husks, basically. And why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because if they can do that, the first chance is to create a new fuel out of this, which doesn't currently exist. And if they can do that, if they can actually extract hydrogen, that's the sort of longer term goal. Then they want to work on how we can convert that energy into a form that is good to be taken around. So can we redesign particularly public transport vehicles and possibly freight vehicles to use that energy as in order to be able to fire up a low or possibly zero emission transport fleet. And as a result of having a transport fleet that operates with zero emissions and lower noise and all the rest of it, how does that impact on the design of your transport network? And therefore, how does that impact on the way you might like to design the way that the city works, including the new build cities? You may have opportunities to have a different sort of transport network because of the technology. So they have a project which goes from sort of molecules and enzymes at one end through to sort of how you design the city at the other end. And it's a very interesting view as to how they are approaching the low carbon city problem. It's completely different, say, from Guangzhou or Shanghai or Tianjin or whatever. So it's a very interesting, and that's partly because they have this company, and the company's clearly doing very well. And they are engaged with us because we can supply them with biochemical engineering that will help them find the enzymes. And we can also help them with some of the transport technology and when it becomes further along the line, with some of the planning ideas that can how you can use that to the most effect. So it's a very nice project from one scale to the other. So their approach to that is rather different from the five demonstrator cities, which, as you say, are essentially a new town, designed with that very much in mind. This is about how we make a city that is currently in existence and wishes to progress in that way.
I wonder if I can. I've got about 5 comments, and you just choose whichever one you may or may not wish to respond to. But the fascinating sort of overarching presentation you made does raise some fundamental issues that go beyond traditional thinking about the projects, as you pointed out. The first point I wanted to allude to is the dictionary that we use in this field. We're as guilty of this as anyone else, but the term mega project is actually a misrepresentation of what we're talking about. And I think that there's, I'm not someone who knows too much about languages, but languages have their own culture, their own values. And if you carry on calling anything beyond a small project a mega project, as we do, you give license to the project managers to treat them as closed systems projects and just think of them in terms of scale. Actually, they're not projects. And I think we need a new dictionary, we need new definitions. What I hear are meta programs of mega projects even. What I hear are mega programs of projects. Anyway, if you see the point, the only reason that's important, and I know my students have heard this before many times, is that so long as we carry on calling them projects, you get politicians and the project managers thinking you can judge them as closed systems where they finish on time, within budget, and there's a whole host of literature which, in my view, and those of you who take my course know this, to a degree pollutes the innovative thinking about problem solving. Because if you see problems in a confined way as projects, you would attack them in that way. So that's the first one. That's the first point. And actually, I was, if I may say, I mean, perhaps students don't realise this, but we have 3 top people in the field, and Peter and Nick are here, and Mike Batty is the other one, who have done a great deal in this field over the years, dealing with complexity, mega projects. The literature is there, it's not being picked up. And I'm going to be a little bit disingenuous to other academics. They're not being picked up because there's a path dependency interest in carving up this field in the old way. Maybe some people won't be talking to me after I've talked about specialists. Anyway, that's my very firm view. And the literature follows it. The journal articles follow it. And when you hand in your literature to be peer-reviewed, they will think that this kind of mega thinking is, what's the word, polemic. They use words like that. That's my first point. I don't know if you're comfortable with that. The second point is, when you look at TENS, when you look at, we actually had dealings with the Inter-American Development Bank who were interested in our work on the appraisal of mega projects. If you look at the kind of scales of TENS, and I know nothing really about Latin America, so it's very interesting, you have to ask the bigger question. If much of this infrastructure is trade-driven, then going back to my starting point about the dictionary of terms, then you need to ask the question, what are the forces that bring the demand and bring the money to build this infrastructure, which is called globalization? Now, if you look at the mantra of globalization, forgetting your ideology for a moment, you will see that it is all interwoven around competitiveness. So what we have is infrastructure which is trying to make certain ports, certain cities, certain regions more competitive than others to get to A, Y, and B. But the paradox is transportation is based upon not just competitiveness, but collaboration, coordination. If you carve up the transportation system, as many private equity investors wish to do, you only cream off the profitable ones and you let the other ones go to seed. You actually don't have a coordinated, integrated transportation system on a global basis. And so even if you look at the TENS program, if you look at the wording, there's social cohesion at one level and competitiveness another, and there's double talk there. You actually got conflicts. and this is not ruled out, because the only area in which globalization and collaboration comes out strongly is in terrorism, is in climate change, and maybe AIDS, or and I think that we need to go back to look at the collaborative, coordinating functions that are not purely based on competitiveness. That's my second point. The third point is John Adams's issue of the accusation of hypermobility. The premise of growth, prosperity and progress and redefined as development is increased mobility, which automatically brings increased wealth by cutting down speed, travel time and costs. The argument is, John Adams' argument and others, is actually hypermobility generates as many problems as it resolves. And so going back to your point, we actually need to know what is it? Is our mega infrastructure to get us from A to B more quickly than the other modes, or is it actually a connecting agent of change function? And I completely concur with the point you made, is that we've got an education system and professions which are basically focusing the wrong thing. They're comfortable with solving problems without actually understanding what they are, and get rather offended when they're actually accused subsequently of creating problems. So the issue of definition of the problem, I think, is absolutely there was another issue which I'll send you the paper. The other issue is, well, I asked the question, who is we? Now, major global infrastructure investment, if you look at the history of it, there's imperialistic sort of activity, there's private sector activity, some of it joined up, some of it not. There's military history, which we haven't even touched on, and security issues. But I think, and let me actually pose that as the main question, since the other four you probably agree with much of what I said. We don't actually know who the big global players are, or if we do, we're not looking at the implications. Are we seeing the emergence of global players in the development of major global infrastructure, which are taking our global infrastructure services and logistics in a way that services their interests rather than the countries, communities, regions that they traverse? We were looking at some work on international infrastructure gateways, and Philip, or was it John, what, in terms of ports, it's just four major players, is it?
Yes, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, and the Netherlands.
And they own what?
Well, it's the majority of ports around the world. They have majority interest.
Do we know the implications of that? And are they the driving the agenda for these projects? And the final point, but especially the case in Latin America, but even here in London, politicians make and break their careers on big projects. I mean, in Latin America, BRT projects have made presidents.
Peñalos.
Sorry?
Peñalos.
Yes, that's right, exactly. I don't think I put Boris quite in the same category. His bikes may be mega in his vision, but not quite in mine. So maybe I just throw it as a concluding question about this issue. If we're not looking for the keys to the solution in the right place, we're looking under the lamppost where the light is. If we actually start looking at global players and seeing whether in fact they are having an unusual influence, not only over governments, but also over regional, international organisations like the EU. Is there a new reality emerging, or is it always the case?
Maybe who is playing that game? I suppose we went back 100 or 200 years or whatever. It would have been political empires.
Yeah.
I guess. And I don't know whether it's still including ports is true. I mean, Portugal and Lima, they were very canny. They divided it in two. And one is basically operated by DP World, which is Dubai, and the other one is operated by Dutch. So they're half each other. They compete with each other. have another crane. So Peru is very nice with millions of cranes. Can't get any trucks into port. They have lots of cranes. And so yes, and I think one wonders how much of the world's decisions are really influenced by the hegemony of the oil producers, shippers, refiners, that whole sector. I think is a very interesting one. If we really wanted to reduce use of fossil fuels, for example, they would be a bit of a problem. And I think so. I think you're right, and they're just not quite sure who it is at the moment. But it seems to me that is one of the big influences. They have huge influence over governments in terms of. Look at the United States, for example. The oil companies have a huge influence in the United States. In Peru, they have legislation in place for desulfurizing diesel fuel and all sorts of stuff. It's all the legislation for having a high-quality fuel provision in Peru is all in place. Refineries refuse to implement it, and they just come along to the government and say, we won't implement it. And the power they have over the government is such that the government caves in every time. So if you can't get the fuel right, if you feed bad food to the animal, you're going to get bad stuff out the back. So it's the same with a car, with a vehicle. So it's really hard to get into the transport emission thing if the government isn't going to bite the bullet of what the refiners are doing. And the refiners are not necessarily Peruvian. Repsol is one, for example. Just thrown out of Argentina, but it's a Spanish company, essentially. So there are whole issues around that. So I think that is absolutely correct. I think the question is to understand how those sorts of players are working. We've seen this small example around here, really, where maybe in countries like the UK, maybe oil companies have less of an influence of that sort here, but information does. So the whole issue around News International is another version of that, and how influence is actually driven by a different sort of resource, and how important it is for governments to have the right communication. It's so important that they will do all sorts of crazy things in order to respond to the challenges thrown up by these people. And it's exactly the same. It's just a different resource. So I think it's absolutely right. Who it is a good question. So I think oil is one. Maybe in a few years it will be water.
It occurred to me as you were just saying, and that's a very final point, is that it may at the end of the day, although come from different resources, land up to who has got the most money to invest in which project. So if you're making a great deal of mineral for oil, then you can actually invest your capital where you want, and then you actually gain a stake in the infrastructure of the countries in Africa. The Chinese example of sovereign wealth funds in Africa is a very good example of that.
Yeah, and they've clearly spotted that's a good thing to do, and other countries have been very slow in doing that.
Are we saying bring back the British Empire?
I'm slightly better than Hitler, I suppose. But yeah, maybe.
Thanks ever so much, guys.